fossil record provides positive evidence for a sudden complex beginning as opposed to a gradual sequence developing over millions of years. I think the creationist can delight in what the fossils tell us. The evolutionists sometimes try to intimidate and tell us that's in favor of evolution, but when you look at what the experts have to say about the matter, you find that's really not the case at all. In the first session, we showed the nature of the beginning of the fossil record, the sudden complex beginning, the distinct separate types right from the start. Arranged similarities tell us of a tree, but they do not come from the fossil record. They're in spite of the fossil record. But if we look at the fossil record in general, after we get past the beginning, just ignoring that problem, how do we see evolution as we look at the fossils that we dig up? Well, we would need to be able to see transitional forms in order to see evolution, things changing from one to the other, and that would be in the form of the transitions. What we see actually is described as stasis, according to Stephen Gould, again one of the leading experts in evolution in our country from Harvard. He says every paleontologist knows that most species don't change. Now, of course, evolution is change, but most species don't do that, he says. That's bothersome, of course, to the evolutionist. That brings terrible distress. I regard the failure, he says, writing in Natural History, to find a clear vector of progress in life's history as one of the most puzzling facts of the fossil record. Well, of course, that's puzzling to him, and it's a failure for the evolutionary prediction. It is just the opposite for the creationist, who is delighted by such evidence, as he describes. He continues saying, "We have sought to impose a pattern that we hope to find on a world that does not really display it." The pattern, of course, being evolutionary progression. He's puzzled by the failure to find that. Now again, that's his description of what we see there. It's the opposite of change that would be predicted. He says in Natural History, we can tell tales of improvement for some groups, but in honest moments, we must admit that the history of complex life is more a story of multifarious variations about a set of basic designs than a saga of accumulating excellence. Now, he uses the word design, though to be fair to him, he doesn't believe they were designed. That's what they look like. He chose that term. But they're telling tales when they tell of this tree of life that progresses upward. That's not from the fossils. What you really see is just variation about a set of basic designs. And this is not new knowledge. Darwin understood this. Back in Origin of the Species, he says innumerable transitional forms must have existed, but why do we not find them embedded in countless numbers in the crust of the earth? Why is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? And of course, if his view of the fossil record is true, then that's exactly what should be found. And he understands, yes, that's what we should see. That's the only way we can see change or evolution in the fossil record, these transitional forms. And there should be more transitional forms since they were leading to the others constantly, but that's not the case. Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this is perhaps the greatest objection which can be urged against my theory. Now, many people think Darwin looked at the fossil record and said, here's proof, but no, he saw this as his biggest problem, and it's gotten worse. Many times people will say, well, it has gotten better. Darwin recognized the problem, but notice the statement by David Rapp of the Chicago Field Museum of Natural History. He's curator of the largest fossil museum in the United States. And he says Darwin was completely aware of this. He was embarrassed by the fossil record because it didn't look the way he predicted it would. He continues saying, well, we're now about 120 years after Darwin, and knowledge of the fossil record has been greatly expanded. We now have 250,000 fossil species, but the situation hasn't changed much. He says, ironically, we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transitions than we had in Darwin's time. He says, by this I mean that the classic cases of Darwinian change in the fossil record, such as the evolution of the horse in North America, have had to be discarded or modified as the result of more detailed information. The classic cases we've lost. Now, that bit of knowledge hasn't made it to most of the textbooks. They still have the evolution of the horse as one of their star classic cases, but one by one they've dropped out, including this one. We've all seen the representation in the textbooks of the little horse that graduates up to the big one. Again, they leave out significant facts that these animals are found side by side up in Kansas in the same stratum. We excavated a 9-foot donkey from the fossil record out near Lubbock, Texas. That kind of messes up the little graduated horse chart. But basically, you're looking at small horses leading to big horses. Notice the description of this by Colin Patterson, and he's curator of the largest fossil museum in the world, recently deceased, senior paleontologist, though, at the British Museum of Natural History for many, many years. He said there have been an awful lot of stories, some more imaginative than others. The more famous example, now he's being interviewed, by the way, by Harper's Magazine. He's in the United States, and he's in the American Museum of Natural History in New York, being interviewed now by Harper's. The most famous example, still an exhibit downstairs, is the exhibit on horse evolution, prepared perhaps 50 years ago. That has been presented as the literal truth in textbook after textbook. And if you're familiar at all with the biology textbooks, earth science textbooks, you've certainly seen that representation. He says, I think that's lamentable, that is, that it's been in all of these textbooks, particularly when the people who show those kinds of stories may themselves be aware of the speculative nature of some of that stuff. He knows that this is not fact, that they have lined them up the way they want them to, even though they find them in the same layers, and that you don't know that one led to the other. It's just the way they tell the story. George Gaylord Simpson is probably the most authoritative source of information on horse evolution. He's the one that came up with this argument. He wrote the book on it. And in his book, Life of the Past, he says the uniform continuous transition of Hydrocotherium into Equus, that's what's pictured in the textbooks, so dear to the hearts of generations of textbook writers, never happened in nature. Now, here's the author of the story, and he says the way it's told in the textbooks never happened. It's lined up as the evolutionist wants it to be lined up, but what does the lineup prove? No more than lining up the pig to the bull to the man. Derek Eager, when this statement was made, was president of the British Geological Association. He says it must be significant that nearly all the evolutionary stories I learned as a student have now been debunked. And he refers to the horse story and to several others. But he does think that many of them, not many, that's not true. He thinks that a few of them, and that's the way he would describe it, are still valid, though most of them that he was taught as a student have been debunked. He refers to Archaeopteryx as perhaps the best example, and we see this in all the textbooks. Here's the half fossil, half a reptile, half bird. This is proof that the reptiles evolved into the birds, and we see this beautiful fossil specimen showing the feathers, I think, of an excellent bird. Some of the beautiful fossils of the feathers testify to that, and we see the wing here of a powered flyer, but we're told, look on the edge of its wings, it has claws. This proves it's primitive. Well, many birds in the fossil record had claws that lost them, and losing things they did have is not an evolutionary progression upward. That involves getting new things, not losing old things. But we do have many birds today. For instance, the Hoatzin maybe is the closest example down in South America that has claws on its wings in the juvenile form, and all of the examples of Archaeopteryx have been the juvenile form. The cassowary, the ostrich have claws on their wings, and so this is not unique and is something birds, the tern, for example, does, and that has lost them, that is, had them in the fossil record. But we're told, look at the teeth. This primitive bird has teeth, and the teeth prove he's primitive. Well, again, he's lost something, and when people lose their teeth, most don't think that's an evolutionary progression. Teeth are amazing structures, and when you study the formation of the teeth and the way the deciduous makes way for the permanent teeth, it's just mind-boggling to see, I think, the design involved in the structure. And birds have lost them. The tern, again, has beautiful teeth in the fossil record. Many of them do, and don't do. They're beautiful, powered flyers today, but they've lost something, and that's not evolution. Many people look at that, I think, inside out. There are modern birds that have teeth today, and so it's not a completely unique situation. But I think the real answer to Archaeopteryx comes from the evolutionary perspective of time. I disagree with their views of time, but let's play the game their way and see how it comes out. If their view of the dating of these fossils is correct, there's a serious problem with a find that was made a number of years ago, here reported in Nature, 1986. The headline's "Fossil Bird Shakes Evolutionary Hypothesis." And here's a bird 75 million years older than Archaeopteryx. That's half again as old as Archaeopteryx was. And it's a bird. It's an excellent bird. Here it refers to the paleontologist at Texas Tech University, Dr. Chatterjee. He and I have worked together a couple of times. They have advanced avian features. This is a good bird that got there before Archaeopteryx did. Well, how can Archaeopteryx lead to the birds if the birds got there first? You can't have the kids older than the parents, you know. It just blows the theory entirely. And actually, this is not the only example of that being found. Birds have been found in a number of instances before, according to their interpretation. The things they've led to have appeared. W. Swenson, I think, sums it up very honestly. He's from Cambridge. In his book, Biology and Comparative Physiology of Birds, he says the origin of birds is largely a matter of deduction. There is no fossil evidence for the stages through which the remarkable change from reptile to bird was achieved. Now, as we think of the tremendous difference between us and something that's up flapping its wings and flying, what would it take to get us, or to get a reptile up and flying? Well, the birds have hollow bones. They have a completely different respiratory system and completely different circulatory system that's necessary to sustain the high rate of breathing and heartbeat and respiration, the high metabolism. It just takes a tremendous amount of change, and there's no evidence of the remarkable change. Now, that certainly doesn't speak well for an evolutionist trying to document change. D.B. Kitts, University of Oklahoma, says the fact that discontinuities, not continuities which would show progression, discontinuities are almost always and systematically present at the origin of really big categories. Now, you would see dissimilarities, you would see gaps in the fossil record due to random sampling and incomplete sampling if it's just random and spaced accidentally. But this is systematic and regular at the origin of really big categories. It's an item of genuinely historical knowledge. Now, D.B. Kitts is a devout evolutionist. He's writing in the journal Evolution and says this is systematic. Anytime you get something that's really different, then you have a gap. And we all know this, though we don't tell it to you in the textbooks typically. Evolution, he says, requires intermediate forms between species, and paleontology does not provide them. Now, if you listen to your earth science teacher, she may tell you that it does, but here is one of the leading authorities in the world writing in the journal Evolution saying you don't see that in the fossil record. David Swift, who is professor of paleontology at the University of Hawaii, writing again in his book Journal Evolution Under the Microscope, no phylum can be traced from a preceding one in the fossil record. We cannot account for the origin of a single phylum. They all appear abruptly. Now, he devoutly believes that they did evolve, but in terms of the fossil record, that's not the picture you see. This is also true of taxonomic groups such as classes, orders, possibly lower still. In other words, you got a major group, it's sudden, and probably true with its classes, orders, and even lower. You got something different, you got a gap. It doesn't lead from one to the other. Again, this is not the creationist telling you that. S.M. Stanley, a very famous paleontologist from Johns Hopkins, says there's not one. In fact, the fossil record does not convincingly document a single transitional form from one species to another. A.C. Stewart expresses the fact that he is confident that this is reality, that is, that it did happen, it did evolve. He says the theoretically primitive type, though, eludes our grasp. And our faith postulates its existence, but the type fails to materialize. These are men of faith. I think they're men of great faith, but it's not based on the evidence, it's in spite of the lack of evidence. In fact, as one individual says, for the evolutionist, their faith is the substance of fossils hoped for, the evidence of links unseen. If you're familiar with the quotation from Hebrews, applied here to the evolutionist, theirs is not based on evidence. It's a blind faith, which I don't think is good faith, either religiously or scientifically. Niles Eldredge explains his justification for my statement. He says, it has been the paleontologist, my own breed, who have been responsible for letting ideas dominate reality. We paleontologists have said that the history of life supports that interpretation of gradual change, which is what he's talking about, all the while knowing that it does not. Now, that's what's required to show evolution, and so we told the story. As Gould says, we can tell stories about this, but in honest moments we have to admit it's just variation about basic designs, and here Niles Eldredge acknowledges that this is just not what we find in the fossil record. We know better, but we keep on telling the story. I don't think that's honest. I don't think it's good science. And when we look at the fossil record, we see why they're squirming and having trouble, because it's not saying what they want it to say. However, one of the reasons Stephen Gould is willing to admit some of these things and acknowledge that this is not really what I would like to see is that he thinks he now has an answer. He thinks he has a solution to the problem that you see a sudden complex beginning, and you see fossils that don't change, and you see gaps between all of the fossils. They're separate and distinct from the beginning, and they stay separate in the fossil record as in the living world. But he can answer that, and so now he didn't really admit that before, but now then he's got an answer in punctuated equilibrium. Sounds very impressive, doesn't it? Actually, it's very similar to an idea that wasn't received quite so favorably back in the 30s. Goldsmith talked about the hopeful monster mechanism, and it was basically, well, it was a very similar idea. And Gould refers to him and says it's similar, and says he thinks Goldsmith would be vindicated. But Goldsmith essentially said when you look at the fossil record and you see the sudden transition of one form to the other, then there must have been a reptile that somewhere laid an egg and a bird hatched out. And that's the way he said it. Well, the geneticist, and that was his field, laughed at him. They preferred to think that he's the one that laid the egg. Hopeful monsters didn't sound very scientific, but he says, well, that's what the fossil record looks like. And so Gould, building on that, said, yes, that's basically what happened. He thinks Goldsmith would be vindicated, but he doesn't call it hopeful monsters. It's punctuated equilibrium, and that, of course, sounds much more sophisticated. Gould and Eldridge wrote a very famous paper several years ago describing this, and in it they say, in fact, most published commentary on punctuated equilibria has been favorable. He says, we're especially pleased that several paleontologists now state with pride and with biological confidence a conclusion that had previously been simply embarrassing. All right, now what is it that they can now have pride in that used to be embarrassing? He says, all these years of work and I haven't found any evolution. Well, if you're an evolutionist, that would be embarrassing. But they don't have to be embarrassed by that now. Not because he now finds the fossils that would solve the problem, but because he has an explanation for why they don't find it. He says, and we'll let Stephen Stanley, who is one who's written papers with them on this subject, describe the nature of what they believe. The record now reveals that species typically reveal, and when they say the record reveals, they're talking about something they've been forced to by the evidence and by very, very detailed studies with thousands of fossils documenting this point. The record now reveals that species typically survive for 100,000 generations, even 1 million or more, without evolving very much. Of course, this is combined with their view of the time. But this is what we see, even assuming the time, that they survive without evolving very much. Now, what does that mean? We seem forced to conclude that most evolution takes place rapidly. Now, you might think that you're forced in a different direction. You look at the fossil record and you don't see change. You see over thousands of generations. They don't change. What does that prove? That things don't change? No, no, no. They don't challenge that. That's sacrosanct. Nobody is going to challenge that. We know that it happened, but we don't see change in the fossil. Well, then the solution is it must have happened rapidly. Never doubt that it happened. It just happened rapidly, and that's what they believe. Notice as he goes on to describe it. A punctuational model of evolution operated by natural mechanism, and notice he has to emphasize this is natural. It may sound supernatural, but no, this is, now he doesn't understand the mechanism, which he'll acknowledge, that made this dramatic change very quickly. But it's natural, whose major effects are wrought exactly where we're least able to study them, in small, isolated, transitory populations. So you don't see this, you can't see this, but we have faith that it happened there in these places where you can't look. The point is that if the transition was typically rapid and the population small, localized, fossil evidence of the event would never be found. And so they conclude you don't have to be embarrassed anymore because you don't expect to find the transitional forms. It happened so quick in these small, isolated areas that we don't even try to find it. Used to be embarrassing, but we're not embarrassed by that fact anymore because now we have an explanation. And so we're looking here at a story that explains why you don't have the fossils to support this transition from one to the other, and they have faced the fact they don't have a mechanism to make this dramatic change from one to the other, because the mechanism that's proposed in the textbooks is this gradual change, mutations being selected over millions of years. Gould addresses that when he says a mutation doesn't produce major new raw material. You don't make a new species by mutating the species. That's an idea people have, that evolution is due to random mutation. A mutation is not the cause. It can't produce this dramatic change that he's looking for And so he's given up on it. In fact, he just says, look, this is deleterious. It is a change in a very complex system, random, accidental, like throwing a rock at your TV set. It's not likely to change it. And so this random, no, it's not going to produce a new mechanism. And so that's not it. So we don't have fossils. We don't have a mechanism. How valid is that kind of a concept of scientific change in terms of evaluating this by the scientific method? On the one hand, you've got fossils that you can observe and don't expect to observe, and a mechanism that you don't know anything about and haven't seen. And on the other hand, you have observed fossils, thousands of them, that show distinct separate kinds, that show sudden complex beginning, that show they stay the same, they don't change, and mechanisms that we observe every day where kind produces kind produces kind. On the one hand, we have billions of fossils that we base our conclusions on, and we have mechanisms that we observe every day. On the other hand, you have mechanisms that you speculate about and haven't observed, and you have fossils that you don't expect to find. Now, just answer the question honestly. Which is better science? Scientists should go by the evidence. They should be compelled by the best explanation of the evidence, and that's not happening here. Philosophy is obviously dominating the ideas. Colin Patterson shows his understanding of this solution, his opinion of it, when he says, well, it seems to me they have accepted that the fossil record doesn't give them the support they would value, so they searched around to find another model and found one. When you haven't got the evidence, you make up a story that will fit the lack of evidence. Now, that may sound rather jaded, but that's his view, and I think he's right on. Again, the curator of the largest fossil museum in the world. When you don't have the evidence, you just make up a story. And when you talk about punctuated equilibrium, that's what you've got. You've got a story about why you don't find the evidence. It is not based on the evidence, but the lack of it. Notice D.B. Kitt's statement again. The claim is made that paleontology provides a direct way to get at the major events of organic history, and that furthermore it provides a means of testing evolutionary theories. The paleontologist can provide us with knowledge that cannot be provided by biological principles alone, but he cannot provide us with evolution. If you're honest about the fossil record, this evolutionist writing in the journal Evolution makes a very honest statement. You don't see evolution in the fossil record. You didn't see it in Darwin's time. That was the biggest problem he had, as he acknowledged, and it's gotten worse since then, as even the cases that he would point to have fallen by the wayside one by one. You can't see it in the fossil record, and you make up stories about why it's not there, which is what's being done. And some, well, let's look at one more tack that's taken by Mark Ridley of Oxford. Totally different approach. He says a lot of people just do not know what evidence the theory of evolution stands upon. They think the main evidence is the gradual descent of one species from another in the fossil record. Yes, this is exactly what we're told, and without the fossils that show progression proving evolution, it would just be an outrageous hypothesis. I think if you're going to prove it, that's where you have to go, even though it's circumstantial and historical, but nevertheless, that's the evidence, and we're told if there's proof, that's where it'd have to be. Well, he says, that's what you think, but you just don't understand it. He says, in any case, no real evolutionist, whether gradualist or punctuationalist, uses the fossil record as evidence in favor of the theory of evolution as opposed to special creation. No evolutionist thinks this way. Well, obviously they do, but he's tried and he's tried and he's tried. It reminds me of the story of the fox in Aesop's fable who's tried to reach up and get the grapes, and he desperately tried and over again failed, and just finds out he can't do it. And walks off saying, those grapes are sour, I didn't want them anyway. You try for hundreds of years to document evolution from the fossil record, and you finally find out with more evidence that it's just not possible. Well, nobody wants those fossils. We don't use fossils. Nobody uses those fossils. I think it's rather comical. It's interesting, but it is true that you can't use the fossils to do it. As E.J.H. Corner of Cambridge acknowledges, much evidence can be adduced in favor of the theory of evolution from biology, biogeography, paleontology, but I still think, to the unprejudiced, the fossil record of the plants is in favor of special creation. And why would he say that? It's in favor of special creation because he sees the sudden complex beginning. He sees distinct separate types from the start. He doesn't see change from one group to another group. He sees stasis as the rule. That's exactly what we predict, and that's exactly what you find. And if you're going to base your conclusions on the facts, that's where you'll have to rest. The evidence, the only way you could document evolution documents, I think, the opposite. When you look at the critical beginning, the sudden, complex, diverse beginning, showing all phyla and no new since, including the major divisions and classes and orders, distinct and separate. Yes, trees of life are in the textbook, but they're from very selected similarities, ignoring others, and those are not based on the arrangement found in the fossil record. They're not from embryology, and they're not from genetics. When you look at similarities, yes, you can see them, but they're in a mosaic pattern. They're not in a branching pattern. Now, that's the evidence of the fossils, as we've seen. Noting the creationist comments, they delight the creationist. They embarrass the evolutionist. These are their terms. And yes, it is embarrassing. It was embarrassing to Darwin. It's more embarrassing now. It's delightful, as Dawkins says to the creationist. And then he says that it was Darwin's biggest problem. Now then it's worse, according to Rapp. The links that we were taught in graduate school have been debunked one after another. It's blind faith, as they describe it, that says evolution. We believe it. We make up stories to explain why there's a lack of evidence, and we have devout faith. But when you just base your conclusions on the facts, you have to say the fossils favor creation. It's a much better explanation of the facts. And that's why I teach, I believe, and demonstrate when we go out and dig up the fossils and when we look at all that have been dug up, that the fossil record is very strongly in favor of creation. Many times people say, well, creationists just object to evolution. They don't have any positive evidence. We have hundreds of thousands of fossils in the museum today which provide positive evidence for a sudden complex beginning and against a gradual slow development over millions of years. I love the fossil record, and I think it is one of the most delightful things that I know about, and certainly in favor of creation.